Bonjour à tous, mesdames et messieurs. J'espère que
Good
la
morning,
journée
ladies and gentlemen.
à votre goût.
I hope you enjoyed
Une
yesterday
journée hier davantage
the
scientifique.
sessions.
Pour ceux qui
It
étaient,
was
pu
as
apprécier les
you
thématiques, les orateurs.
know,
Une
a
journée
very
scientifique
scientific
avec à la fois des
subject
approches,
with
je dirais, très
different
physiologiques,
subjects
le
and many
regard avec des
speakers.
approches plus
So we've had
culturelles,
the
sociologiques.
physiological aspects
Donc, tout ça
along
qui,
with the
finalement, sont des éléments
cultural
qui convergent
and the socio-economic
autour
aspects,
goût,
all
de la
converging
nutrition et de
elements,
la
of
santé.
course,
Aujourd'hui, nous
when
sommes
it
sur cette
comes
deuxième
to
journée
nutrition and health.
sur une
Today
dimension
is the
beaucoup
second
plus
morning of this
marché.
conference.
Et où on parle
We are
d'innovation,
now going to consider markets, innovation, anticipation. So for this first conference,
Monsieur Rémy Oudghiri,
we have Mr.
à qui je vais demander de
Rémy
me rejoindre,
Oudghiri from
qui va
the Ipsos
vous présenter les
Institute,
tendances
who's going to present you the trends for
2020. Voilà, donc c'est important de pouvoir
not
se
next year or the year after, but for
2020. Vitagora, donc en partenariat avec
so it's very important to have this kind of vision. So Ipsos, in partnership with Vitagora, is therefore presenting to us a kind of foretaste of the survey on taste and consumption. So Mr. Oudghiri, you have the floor. Mr. Oudghiri is the department of the department called Trends and Insights.
Bonjour, m'entendez bien?
Good morning, can you hear me? Well, the subject today is the future of our food, of our nutrition, through a survey that we have carried out. It's only a summary that I will be presenting here, a summary of the most salient features of this survey. And of course, there are plenty of other elements that can be further dug into, and I'm sure that you will in the course of the coming weeks. Let me first of all remind you about the objective of this survey. There were two major objectives. In fact, we are now in a fast-changing society for which we get more and more data. It was therefore important to try and understand which this movement, dynamics, changes would introduce not only in our lifestyle but also in our eating habits. So we wanted to think of a next future. 2020 or 2020 is not so far from us. It's only 7 years from now, and we wanted to try and know what would be developing in that time span, particularly in the field of nutrition and in the field of taste and health. These are two major trends and will remain so for the coming years, obviously. Now, the second objective was to supply you with a kind of framework, international framework, because this survey was conducted in several countries, for you to better understand the future of food consumption, but also to understand the opportunities. This should be seen as a tool that will help you understand the opportunities for your markets, for your niche. This is exactly what you can tell from this survey. So to do so, we had to think of a specific I would say structure. We're not reading out of a crystal ball, of course. There's nothing that allows us to predict the future, but we know about some the dynamic elements. We know about how the world is being structured through technologies because of the aging of the population, for example. So we know that there are some technological demographic elements that are known to us and for which we already have data which allow us to have some prospective thinking for the year 2020 and above and over. So yesterday you considered the current technological aspects related to food, what is being done in laboratories. For example, just a few months ago, a Dutch team has produced the first artificial steak produced from beef cells and announced that, saying that in 10 years from now, artificial meat would be the solution to a huge demand, knowing that the offer won't be, the supply, sorry, won't be able to meet the demand. So this is about it. This is what is going on in laboratories currently, research laboratories. But our concern was rather to consider the demand, that is to try and understand the consumers' needs and to understand how these consumers are going to express their needs in the short term. So it's a complementary vision of the work carried out by research laboratories. So the idea for us was to try and understand trends for 2020. To do so, we have therefore, so to speak, built a system which is multi-tiered. First of all, we started working with a network of experts from various origins, sociologists like Jean-Pierre Poulain or Jean-Pierre Corbeau. We also worked with nutritionists, psychologists, experts in quality, experts in lifestyle and consumption. This in different countries, in the USA, in Germany, in France, in Japan, etc. So we try to have the support of experts who've been very helpful in trying to decipher the current evolutions seen in those various countries. Now, the second tier is in Ipsos, our institute. Ipsos is an institute that is dedicated to running mainly opinion surveys and in charge of following emerging trends, societal trends, actually. So there again, we pulled all the data we had to try and understand the evolution of practices and usages of consumers and of consumption. But that went beyond the framework of Ipsos. We also used statistical figures produced by the OECD, Eurostat, the WHO, etc. So we did a work of aggregation, of compilation of data to try and be ready to better understand the future. And last but not least, the important point, once trends were then deciphered, understood, interpreted and validated with experts, we then turned to the consumers to understand who could be a part of those trends. In fact, the idea was to give you the potential opportunities to try and understand how many people those trends, will be of interest. This is just to give you a kind of relative weight of each of these trends. For the countries that you see here on the screen, France, Germany, Russia, USA and Japan. So we then came up with a representative sample of the population between 16 and 84 years of age, 1,000 people per country, and we tried to see with them what were their positions with respect to these trends and if they were ready to get on board. So this is exactly what I'm now going to present to you. Now that's about methodology. What about the approach? So we started from the major macro trends, and we try to decipher their impact or understand their impact on the consumption modes, particularly when it comes to foodstuff. And last, of course, we highlight the priority trends for 2020. That is the approach that we have been following. Of course, it's a pretty heavy system, which means a lot of repetition, but this is the best way to better understand the trends that will certainly be of interest for the next decade. So let's start with our starting point. We started with the major demographic evolutions. I will just highlight a few of them. If you are a member of the Vitagora cluster, you'll get the full report. But that was not a surprise. The major trend today, of course, is the aging of the population. As you can see, in all countries, the proportion of people above 65 is increasing and in particular in Japan, they'll be having something like 30% of this population by 2020. This figure, this trend, is valid not only for those 6 countries, but for most countries. So aging of the population was one point. We also collected data in terms of health, which of course are very important. Today we are, I would say, at the turning point in history in terms of health. Epidemics are regressing and will be more and more regressing, but diseases like cancer or cardiovascular diseases, which are directly related to our lifestyle, will be growing in the next future and with high consequences for 2020. That is that the relationship between lifestyle and diseases is really obvious now, but that means that people are already, well, they are already aware of that, but they will even be more aware in the future of the way in which their lifestyle and their food impacts their health capital. So this is again something which is important to think about in our analysis. Obesity is also another heavy trend which is going to further increase on a worldwide scale. This is of course because, again, of different lifestyles worldwide. Even if we try to combat such habits, diabetes is also a pretty unbelievable phenomenon. If we try to look into 2030, then we will have up to 54% of people suffering from diabetes, and the growth rate is absolutely spectacular in Africa, China, Brazil, etc. So this is obviously something which is very important for our analysis. Now, if it comes to another subject, we have to think of the fact that people are more and more connected, using smartphones, pads or tablets, etc. So the exchange of communication has been multiplied by 11 in some areas like Asia, for example. So when we think of 2020, we have to understand that this is going to be part of the consumer's lifestyle. So using connected devices, whatever they are, electronic devices, will be of course very important, with something like 80 billion smart devices that will obviously have an impact on not only the lifestyle in general, but also on the feeding habits, on the eating habits. We also have to consider other elements, like, for example, the higher number of single people being single. And this means, of course, a lot in terms of lifestyle, in terms of eating habits. One important point to remember, and this is pretty clear, if we think of major trends like aging or the increase of specific diseases and the concern for prevention of the population, well, these trends, of course, will have an impact on our daily environment, on the daily environment of consumers. In the senior citizens, of course, the issue of loss of autonomy is one source of concern. The increase of diseases means that there will be an important need for better maintaining your physical fitness. People will ask for more tone, if I may say, and productivity, and society will certainly exert a high pressure on how to maintain your physical capital, your fitness, etc., and your health capital. So these are all elements that we took into account for this survey. Now, once everything was fed into the system, assessed and validated, when we were able then to check with the actual consumers, we were able to identify a few trends. Altogether, there are 15 such trends which can be used as a tool if you, or that you shouldn't miss for the future. So I'm not going to review those 15 trends today, that would be far too much, but there are in fact 3 major blocks. The first, and that's not a surprise, is that of health. Many of such trends focus on perfect health with a concern for geronto food, food for the elderly, and also for connected food. This is a trend which is emerging in North America. There is another block where that we name the empire of the senses. That is that pleasure will, of course, be still a prominent feature. This is something that is permanent, so the mix and match, the cosmetic aspect of food, the evolution technologies that are available or are part of all this. And the third block is about the new philosophies of taste. In the future world, health and pleasure will count all together. People will be cautious to maintain their health capital, but also will be cautious to have fun and pleasure. So some such trends will try and reconcile these two elements. We've tried to be a bit creative by using different names for the various items in this block. So that's beautiful, good, and nice, etc., etc. These are trends that you should keep in mind for the future. Let's consider two of them, and then we will try to review the situation per country with, of course, as a background picture, the possible opportunities that can be developed either here in France or in other countries. Our objective was not to produce a kind of sci-fi work. Our objective was really to be relevant, and because of everything that we've been able to collect in terms of information, the objective was to identify what would be the dominating ideas in people's mind or the dominating concern in people's minds, and therefore to deliver a solid reflection for you to get on board with. Now, the first trend that we observed was a kind of return to the roots, if I may call it that. The return to the or being back to the roots. This is a trend that has already started and which is going to further amplify over the next few years. These two aspects are related to the fact that people are extremely cautious with respect to their food. So we have already observed that in France, the back to our roots movement is indeed very present in France, and people like better what seems to be natural, which is to them associated to the idea of being healthy. So the question of being natural is very important. Now, the eating locally is also very strong in many countries, not only France, but even, I would say, stronger in the USA, for example, or in North America. I'll give you an example with Japan in a second. But the idea here is that we have dealing with producers with a face. You know your local producer. So that provides us with the notion of trust. We trust those producers, and we know that our society is extremely cautious today and with respect to foodstuff. So it's important to trust the person that delivers your food. And in this Back to Our Roots movement, we have seen in the USA in particular, but also in France, well, this has created quite a lot of debate. We have a kind of return to the homemade type of food, with the idea that you're having control of your food. And which means that you are close to your roots. So this is a way of feeling more secure and to show that you have control. Let me give you an example with Japan, which was one of our test countries. Japan has had a pretty strong shock. It was hit by a shock, the shock of Fukushima only recently. And what has changed since then is certainly their relationship with food and the origin of their food. They are now cautious about the food they have, and they fear that the food that is being served to them might be contaminated in the absence of control. So for this reason, over the past few years, over the past 3 years actually, in all sorts of places, markets have developed in all sorts of places like railway stations, etc., or car parks. Local producers are then selling their produce, and this is a very new trend, as the little video we're now going to project shows.
Fresh organic food is usually hard to come by in Japan's capital, but as NTD's Yukichi Negishi shows us, you just have to look in the right spots.
Here at Earth Day Market in Shibuya Ward, Tokyo, local farmers and vendors come once a month to sell organic food and other necessities made from all natural resources. For Tokyo residents, this is a chance to get their kitchens filled with healthy food, as organic products are hard to find in regular supermarkets.
People in Tokyo, people in the big city, don't have a chance to meet the farmers. But this market, you can talk with farmers directly, and which is very good chance for people to learn about the farmers or agriculture.
Ikuma Saga says that the vendors at Earth Day Market sell the freshest organic food.
We would like many farmers who are working on organic or no pesticides, or we prefer those kind of farmers. And also we prefer nearby farmers, because we think this market is a kind of a movement.
Good organic food is a balance between reasonable price, great taste, and good health. Kanera Suzuki, a farmer from Fukushima Prefecture, is selling persimmons and Jinnenjo mountain yams, which took him years to grow.
This is our long yam. After planting the seed, it takes 3 years to mature. We cultivated this real vegetable, so we hope you can enjoy it. This is our all-natural dried persimmon. We grow it without fertilizer and without agrochemicals, so you can rest assured it's safe and delicious.
Besides food, there are other great all-natural products at Earth Day Market. Who would have thought volcanic ash is good for the skin? The Body Clay company makes skincare products using just that.
Our product is called body clay. It's not made from dirt. Instead, it's made from solidified volcanic ash. Volcanic ash solidifies after erupting out of volcanoes. We get our volcanic ash from mountains in Niigata, Yamagata, and Gunma Prefecture. The volcanic ash we use, called marronite, is from Japan. When you apply it to your skin, it creates a thin layer that heals dry skin.
Earth Day Market is held once a month on Saturdays at Yoyogi Park in Shibuya. Organizers hope to have it every day all across Japan someday. I'm Yukichi Negishi, NTD, Tokyo, Japan.
So that's back to our roots in Japan, and this is something that we see in many countries. In the USA, they have initiated the farm-to-fork movement, a growing movement as well, which is translated in more restaurants getting the farm-to-fork label. There are papers, there are websites dedicated to this movement, and there are also major distribution storehouses who started implementing this concept. You now grow your veggies on the roof of your building, on the roof of the supermarket. It's an initiative which is more than emerging, actually, and the restaurant I mentioned produce part of the veggies that they cook. So there's a real movement towards our roots, and this is going to be further amplified in the coming years. if we take a look at the countries that have been investigated, those that have already started this movement, or where this movement was already started, are the USA and Germany. In particular, Japan is only starting, but the movement is going pretty far. And if we try and project for 2020, if we try and consider the number of people who are interested and who think of embarking for the coming years, figures are really high. The trends are really high in all countries, which means that we have already initiated something which is visible. The trend is already visible, so we have to understand that this trend is going to be further developed by 2020, and which is very important. Now, this is a pretty rational approach. People try to be reassured, to get some degree of trust, try to compensate for the lack of information, so it's a very rational approach. There's of course an emotional aspect to it, because you can have only local food, but the second trend that we have seen developing for the 2020 period is that of emotions. In particular, with an importance placed on feelings, emotions, pleasure, etc. when it comes to food. This is already started in some countries. We have, for example, some products that find it, when those so-called light products find it difficult to find an audience, and they are now rather boasting about the pleasure you can derive from eating such food, whereas in the past the idea was about restriction and no pleasure. Think of the so-called comfort food in the USA, food that is reassuring to people. This used to be somewhat stigmatized because of obesity, for example. Now there's a strong comeback of this food, and of course the situation since 2008 is improving, but they've also been through a major crisis and are back to the idea of having some fun and pleasure in eating. Remember these little chocolate balls, for example, that you can nibble. That's also associated to pleasure. Think of the boom of chocolate. For example, in France, chocolate and sweets have increased by 50% just in France. So those so-called pleasure markets are now increasing, and not only in France, but they are the sign of not only a change in the situation, but in the perception of consumers. They really want to find their personal balance and not just follow blindly any type of diet. So it's really a strong movement in the USA, and this is something that we have seen now in Europe with the so-called intuitive food movement. The idea is to forget about following a diet. Diets are useless. Many research works have shown that this is the case. There are many books, anti-diet books. So the best is to find oneself fine and fit, to find the right balance, and to forget about being slim at all costs. Besides, the idea is to eat without complex, just by listening to your body, to your needs, and this is a movement which is developing and which will further increase in the coming years, and this is really very strong in the USA. In France as well, some trend leaders have already started developing this particular area with a few books published on the subject. So this is a trend that can be seen. More and more people don't want to take into account the dietary rules of diets. In France, there is a lack of interest, a current decrease in the interest shown to diets, for example. And for the future, it seems that the trend is going to be further increased. More and more people are tempted to say that they just want to have control over their own food, but altogether have pleasure when they eat, and therefore get rid of those dictatorship rules for dietary principles. So this is a strong trend which is going to be further developed. So back to our roots is a dimension which gives a different structure to food. For 2020, we have this dimension of not only the return to the roots, but the fact of having pleasure. So altogether with being healthy. I would now like to focus on trends which have already appeared pretty strongly in some countries. Let us talk about connected food, if this, even if this sounds somewhat odd. We know how important connected items and devices are. Actually, it's in the USA that we find this new habit which consists in measuring everything. It's the so-called self-quantifying movement. It's because we now have tools that allow us to assess, measure, evaluate all sorts of things. Our meals, our shopping list, our heart pace, etc. So in the USA, a lot of devices are now available on the market. They were presented through various shows and fairs, but are now available on the market, like scales, for example. And there are many apps. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but there are something like 100,000 applications, apps dedicated to following your health. So, of course, they're not all perfect, but this just shows the wealth of opportunities that lay ahead of us. In fact, more and more people, providing you get a simple interface, providing you need not spend too much time trying to understand, more and more people are really in demand for this kind of devices. Actually, it's also in the USA that the prep pad scales have been introduced. It not only allows to weigh the food, but also to show the content and the calories of each food. And this is important in the USA. Now we have a video for that.
This is food. This is also food. Food is a craft and a source of comfort. It can be tricky. It can be fuel. It can be social. What and why you eat may vary, but your understanding of food doesn't have to. Introducing Prep Pad, the smart food scale that gives you real-time insight into what you eat. Understand your food's nutritional balance based on weight, not labels. Whether it's one ingredient or an entire meal, Prep Pad shows you how it all adds up, so you can make little adjustments, not big sacrifices. Prep Pad works with brand name foods and homemade foods and reveals the whole spectrum so you can know exactly what you need and make better choices for the whole family. With Prep Pad, you can set goals, keep resolutions, and squeeze the very best out of life. Prep Pad. Connect with your food.
Voilà, donc la connexion qui s'invite dans nos assiettes.
So, a connection even on our plates. So this is what we have in the United States, but also in England. There's the first restaurant offering edible code QRs or QR codes. These are becoming more and more commonplace. You know, code bars on products. You can scan the barcode and it tells you what's in it. There are also sushi restaurants offering this, although there is a certain amount of suspicion about them. Because of tuna fishing, consumers don't want to feel ashamed or guilty about what they eat, so they can check where the fish was caught. So these codes are based on rice paper, so they're edible, and they can be used to connect up to information. You can check the origin of the product in your plate, for example. people. So these are emerging trends, but they are also likely to inspire interest in the current context. So when we look at these trends, we know that 1 American out of 4 today uses an application either via a smartphone or a tablet to monitor what they're eating. This is a fairly impressive figure. The French are behind, the Japanese are in a different position. So the French are not very hot on this topic, we're more or less resistant. But in Japan, the trend is different. We can imagine more and more people following what they eat. So connected food is therefore a trend that has to be looked into if we want to know more, if we want to focus on the United States, where that trend is currently emerging. So now let's go across the, come back across the Atlantic and go to Germany and have a look at this new trend, which is in fact more than just a trend for vintage products. So next month there will be a vintage exhibition near Freiburg. It's the first of its kind, but already many events like this have taken place in Germany. So, sorry, raw cooking, not vintage cooking, but raw cooking. So the idea behind this approach is that you have to have as many raw ingredients and as little alteration as possible. So it's the idea of having something that's tasty, but raw, so something that's original, something that's very simple at the same time, and that has not been altered. And in Germany, you can already see the first books of recipes for raw cooking. And again, it's not just the notion of pleasure that is central, it's the notion of health as well that is underlined. So there are two aspects important for 2020 and that are being promoted by this trend. On the one hand, you've got the health preoccupation, and then you have the desire for pleasure. So, several years now, this revolution has been taking place in German. The Revolution Festival in Berlin is organized every year. It allows caterers, chefs, different people to really focus on this raw culture. And this is what we'll see in the film.
Die Revolution ist ein Aufbruch zu einer natürlich gesunden Welt, denn es vermittelt den Menschen Tausende von Ideen, wie sie auf ganz natürliche Weise genussvoll und gesund leben kann. Es gibt da sowas von fantastische Rezepte, dass wir einfach immer nur glänzende Augen sehen bei den Vorführungen. Wir packen sozusagen den Frühling in den Mixer rein.
Voilà, donc une vision très positive. On parlait beaucoup de santé et de plaisir dans le film.
So you can see there's a big focus on pleasure and health in the film. Obviously, when we look at our figures, it's Germany that is dominating in this area, but other countries are also following this trend. And when we think ahead to 2020, we can see that Germany is high up on the list, but it's also, you can also see that there are Japan, France, and the USA. So it's certainly something that is attracting interest. People are thinking about this. It's just a question of offer. So it's something that is emerging, just emerging today. So now let's move over to Japan, or let's go back to Japan to talk about a trend, the beautiful and the good. And we wonder whether for Japan this is not something that could be transposed to other countries. So the beautiful and the good. So in Japan, there is this idea that eating well, eating good things, is about feeling good about yourself. When it's good, it is in opposition to what has been processed, what is produced by industry. There's also this association of what's good and what is beautiful. You know, eating and the notion of psychological benefits, feeling better about yourself. So these things are increasingly associated. And then there's the idea that food plays a determining role in our physical appearance. That's something that we've been seeing a lot recently in Japan. So it's not new as such. It's been around for a while, but it picked up speed over the past few years, and this is being reflected in the collagen diet. Collagen is all about eating proteins with many virtues for our joints, for example, but it also has an effect on the firmness of our skin, and therefore it slows down the appearance of wrinkles. So a collagen diet is today very, very fashionable in Japan, and the promise, the advantage for the consumer is all about eating healthily, following a healthy diet, but also preserving their physical appearance. Again, in Japan, an Italian restaurant launched the idea of a salad that makes you beautiful. So it's based on 15 different herbs. It has all kinds of virtues, thyme, nails, skin. So these are things that interest Japanese consumers today. And when we look at the figures concerning people following these kinds of trends in terms of, you know, eating in order to improve physical appearance, when we look at the population that is interested, obviously there's a change of scale, because in Japan, it's a large percentage of the population that is concerned. So you will have noticed that often France is a little bit behind everybody else. We're a little bit reticent. And I'd like to bring up an interesting question here. When we look at France from an international point of view, we realize that French consumers, as we know, have a specific relationship with their food. Especially, we are somewhat reticent to try out new products when they appear, whereas the Italians, Spaniards and Germans are quite happy to do that. So we're distrusting. And that's why innovation in France is more difficult in France than in other countries. And some countries may be more advantageous than France from this point of view when it comes to selling new products. So there are 2.0 dinner trends that are emerging in countries like the United States. The idea is to meet up with people via platforms and then to go out to dinner together. So that concept is developing in quite a number of countries, but again in France we're pretty reticent. This is a new concept, so connected food. We mentioned connected food earlier on. Our German neighbour gives a bigger mark, a bigger rating than we do. In fact, in France, if I give you the ratings for all trends, this is a question that we asked about each trend. We asked to have a rating in terms of pleasure. So in France, there is one trend that is very popular, and that is the idea of going back to our roots. It's very strong in Asia, but it's also very strong in France. It's characterized by a kind of an unlatching, if you like. There's a traditional food cult. There's a gastronomic culture in France. When you ask what is the symbol of France, any average French person will talk about gastronomy. There are other trends as well, opening up to food mixing and matching. But in France, notably in our relationship to food, there is this avoidance kind of strategy. In France, we associate we associate food and health, but it's all about avoiding rather than adding things in France, adding vitamins or adding food supplements. So in the survey, what we really see is that this kind of food characteristic that is specific to the French. Food in France has to be taken in a certain way. I really want to show you this film. Some of you have maybe seen it already. It came out a month ago. It's a film made by Carrefour that gives us an example of how we perceive food in France.
Carrefour présente Origine et Qualité, un partenariat de 20 ans avec près de 20 000 producteurs français qui travaillent main dans la main avec Carrefour. Des bons produits frais, c'est ça, Origine et Qualité.
Allons en parler avec Thierry Grindorge. Bonjour Thierry. Bonjour. On est au cœur du pays d'Auge et vous produisez un vrai camembert de Normandie, Origine et Qualité Carrefour. C'est quoi en fait?
Eh bien ces camemberts, je les fabrique avec du bon lait cru de vache 100% normande. Et la fabrication se fait selon les méthodes traditionnelles.
J'ai même entendu dire qu'il est moulé à la louche. À quoi ça sert?
Ça permet de ne pas briser le cahier en petits morceaux. C'est mieux pour le goût. Les camemberts sont affinés dans nos caves pendant plus de 35 jours. Puis vous savez, ici on en fabrique depuis 1908.
Des vaches de race normande, un lait exceptionnel, une fabrication tout à la main. Bravo pour votre savoir-faire. C'est ça le véritable camembert de Normandie, Origine et Qualité Carrefour. Regardez comme il est fait à cœur. Avec du bon pain frais, un délice.
Origine et Qualité, aussi exigeant sur la qualité que sur le prix.
Bon, voilà, typiquement le type de
So there we are, a typical illustration of this very strong trend in France. 100% natural food, local food. We also use connection virtues with the codes on the products. So that's in order to rebuild trust in the consumer. So it was important to have this point of view because France stands out as different in the food universe at a world level. Now, just to finish, I want to show you how what I've talked about, and I haven't mentioned every trend, how we can use this analysis framework. Basically, our ultimate goal is to understand what the big trends will be in 2020. So we can class them in terms of potential. You know, how much potential do these trends have? There are some that are already very dynamic and that will be growing fast. There will be others that are not that dynamic or only dynamic in some countries. And other trends only represent a niche potential. So target products that can be extremely profitable. So getting back to our roots, that is the trend with the strongest potential, whatever the stage. The idea of being eating food without any complexes, raw cooking. The results of the survey are quite surprising because it's quite high up in the hierarchy, whereas connected food concerns a niche area. So the study allows us to look at things on a global level, but also on a country-by-country level. Some countries have higher trends than others, so it's a rating scale that allows us to look at, you know, whereabouts we are in a certain country, whether we're mainstream, whether we're niche, you know, whereabouts we are. But more importantly than this, remember we asked the question about pleasure in the survey. So how do you cross the potential with the notion of pleasure? There are trends that are promoted by the health dimension and perhaps less so by the pleasure dimension, whereas others are really promoted by the idea of pleasure. So it's important to cross-reference the trends with the notion of pleasure so that we can identify how we can reconcile these two points of view. We know that the trends will be developing, but how will they develop? There are trends that are interesting and that are focused more on pleasure, and there the challenge will be to convince people about the pleasurable aspect of their food. And then there are dimensions that will be focused on pleasure, but will be of less interest because of the health question. Or because they are more of a niche product. So the idea is to position these 15 trends country by country. So this is what the kind of exercise might look like for France. So you can see that clearly in France. This is what we heard about earlier on. You can have the idea of the back to roots, maximum marks being given to pleasure, strong potential, because we're in a context where consumers need to be reassured, need to be able to control what they're eating, need to look at things from a local point of view. And then you can position all of the trends. So for connected food, that's not where you have the highest potential. That's where you have a population that's going to be difficult to convince. It really depends on the impact of the trend. So basically the objective of the study, again, I've been through things very quickly, but the objective of the study is first of all to allow us to understand where consumers will be going in the next few years, but it also allows us to see on a country-by-country basis the diagnosis, whether it's the same, whether the results of the diagnosis are the same. But this means that we can identify opportunities. Companies can identify opportunities. So it's more of a starting point than an arrival point. So the idea is to say, okay, whereabouts am I positioned in my category? How can I make headway? And this is what Vitagora helps with and will be helping with in the coming months. So I hope that I will have inspired you to go further into the results of this survey through this presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Alors, je pense est-ce qu'il y a du temps pour les questions?
I don't know whether we have any time for questions.
Si vous avez des questions,
if you have any questions or remarks, yes?
Bonjour, Claire Sulmon-Rossé.
Claire Sulmon-Rossé from INRA. Thank you very much for that great presentation. Is it not something of a paradox to have a trend focused on what is natural and what is connected? And then, connected devices allowing us to follow our diet together with the abandoning of any form of diet. Is that not paradoxical? Yes, the trends don't concern everybody. In France, there are people who have their wristbands, their fitness wristbands, they're measuring things the whole time. There are people who, as soon as they go into a park, they measure the number of kilometers that they've covered, and when they get back home, they enter that onto their computer. But in France, there is also a very strong attraction for local producers, open-air markets, etc. So we're not talking about a contradiction. theoretically there is a contradiction, but people who are focused on connection do not necessarily want to reject everything that's natural. They may be focused on health. They want to improve, progressively improve their lifestyle by trying to remain fit and have the right weight. And to do that, they also want to eat naturally. You can have different populations, but even the same people can have different likings. You know, people can be connected to their smartphone constantly, but also prefer to eat natural foods. So in a country like France, we're not talking about populations that have been necessarily reconciled. And you were talking about diets. Yes, that may appear fairly strange, but there is a point that struck us, and that is common between the idea of, you know, I'm measuring what I'm doing increasingly, how can I improve my personal performance, my lifestyle, and I talked about intuitive food. So in both cases, there's the idea of getting back to us as individuals. Increasingly, we're seeing that applying recipes that are supposed to be applicable to everybody are destined to fail because they're frameworks that don't take into account individuals, their idiosyncrasies, and that's what's changing today. And the two movements, if you like, if you ask me, even if they may appear contradictory, people don't want to follow diets anymore. People want to do something that suits them as individuals. It's all about focusing on individualization. And the technological tools are helping with that personalization thrust. So it does look contradictory at first view, but basically it's still the same idea. I want to free myself of any limiting framework, and I want to build myself with the right kind of food. Develop myself with the right kind of food. Yes, another question?
Bonjour.
Yes, hello. Thank you. François Guillon, thank you for this very stimulating presentation. I'm wondering about this notion of trend. It's very frightening. 15 trends. I have the impression that what we're seeing here is a kind of mosaic. And this notion of micro markets or individualization, each consumer is going to mix and match things to suit their individual likings. So is mass marketing behind us? Do we have to move towards micro marketing? How do you link this, these two, trend and mosaic? I think that if you're focused on innovation, you know, these are just different stimuli. You just need to find the right box in the right place, and the success of the product is, you know, all about providing the right supply for a given demand. So the mosaic reflects our society, and increasingly people are looking for, well, they're open up to mixing and matching, that's for sure. You know, you don't have a connected food on one hand and the idea of going back to our roots on the other. You have to think about things and how these things can be reconciled. So it's all about proposing things that make sense. So we have got this society that is made up of a mosaic. It's complicated. We're all different, that's for sure. And on top of that, we evolve differently. So we can start by being interested in one trend and then change as we move on. So I understand what you're saying, and it is quite disturbing. It means that we have to keep a lot of things in mind, but there are two ways to position ourselves. Either we choose a specific area to focus on with a real potential, a real target, a real need, an area where we can really offer something that is logical. That is probably the most natural strategy to adopt. Or you accept the idea of that mosaic and then you offer products that are in line with that mosaic. In a world that is increasingly hybrid, that's what we may have to do. It's more complicated. It means inventing things. There are things that don't exist. And even if people are more open today, we're talking a lot about bistronomy today. So traditionally we had gastronomy and a bistro. There were two opposite worlds. For gastronomy, you have all the ceremony and the ritual traditions that go hand in hand with gastronomy. And today, new generations, chefs in particular, there is a young generation of chefs that really wants to have gastronomic quality in a much more flexible framework, a much friendlier framework, without, having to be, limited. And I think that the bistronomy corresponds to these two dimensions that may appear contradictory at first sight. Now, I have a second question, if I may ask it. Your study looks at 5,000 consumers in rich countries, in 5 rich countries. It really makes me want to carry out another study on the rest of the world. To see what happens to your trends in the rest of the world. Yes, you're right. And I'm thinking about China in particular, where they're not really focused on those trends. Today, their relationship to food is also very complicated. There's a lot of distrust. In the West, we tend to be critical in terms of brands, whereas in China, they're devoted to brands because brands reassure them. There have been so many scandals in terms of pork, milk. So I think that the idea of going back to our roots is going to be a worldwide phenomenon. But effectively, in emerging countries, they're not at the same stage of development, so they won't follow the trends in the same way. But I'll keep that in mind. Thank you. Yes, Odile Parizel from Paritech. I have a question concerning the drives behind these trends. There's the demographic context, I imagine, the current situation, what consumers are saying, their food culture, and the food offer. When you define these trends, how do you take into account all of these components? And are there any drivers that seem to be more important than others? Is it the food offer, for example, that is the main motor behind a trend? Is it the context? Do you have an answer to that question? Well, that's a difficult question. You're asking what the relative weight of each is. In fact, the scope of the study doesn't allow us to do it because we would have had to have measured everything in the same way, according to the same protocol, in order to have the right statistics. So I think I'm going to be disappointing in my answer. We use all of these elements, obviously. The offer plays an important role, but that's not enough. The offer has to be in line with a certain population. At Ipsos, our work, my work, is above all to look at what concerns the consumer, what concerns the individual. Know what is the individual's environment today and what will it be like in the future. So I just touched on these things, but in the report you have more details. So you look at the environment, you look at, how the individual might think about all of these things, what is their relationship to all of these things, and then there's a third dimension, and that is the offer. If there wasn't an offer, you can have a big trend, but and people are being surveyed all the time in our day and age. So the offer plays a role that's very important, but actually saying what is more important, well, I don't think you can just forget about the first two for innovation in particular. If you want to imagine new things, that's what you have to start with. So you take into account these two components, these different components. You just don't take into account what the consumer says. So there are industrialists' offers, local stakeholders' offers, company offers. We look at these, and that's what I showed you earlier on. We set up a monitoring system. We look at new positions emerging in France, in Japan, and in the United States. But what we're really interested in is really understanding these offers and seeing whether they meet what people are asking for. Obviously, they do have an influence. So the consumer has a need. Connected food. Well, that comes from the technological offer that creates a need. So there are consumers who need information, who are mistrusting. In the United States, they're very much focused on performance. In the United States, they measure everything. There are metrics for everything and anything. As long as they have a figure, they're happy. So connected food is more ahead of other trends in the United States, and that's why.
Bonjour.
Yes, hello.
Annick Van Campenot
for the commitment program in Quebec. In Quebec, we're thinking about passing on the message or not passing on the message in terms of improvements to the offer. Should we be telling consumers that we've removed 25% of the sodium content from a product? If we look at the trends, people don't necessarily want to know, or they want to know certain things. And in Quebec, in industry, in the future, does industry have to get organized to offer things that are good for health? People don't necessarily want to know whether it's good. They may want to know where a product comes from, and from a health point of view, a food processor will a food processor have to pass on this product improvement health message, or will the processor hide the information but still make the improvements? I don't think they're going to hide the information. I don't think that's going to be the main point, but it's certainly something that can contribute to an increase in the preference for a product, because it's reassuring. In this idea of going back to our roots, these trends that came up in our survey, what people really dream about is going right back to our roots. So the more information we can give them about the fact that there isn't this, there is less of that, I think that's important, but it mustn't become the main argument. That's the thing. If it becomes the main argument, then it won't work. And this is what we're seeing on the market. I don't think these things should be hidden. They have to be mentioned, but we mustn't hope that thanks to this information we have a driver that's going to encourage people to buy the product. It's just about being transparent. It's a bit like today. It's like being environmentally friendly. It's important, but it's not going to be a main driver for business. It's important for trust.
Plus de questions? Ah, il y en a encore une dernière.
Bonjour Agnès Marcet-Palieri d'AgroParisTech. Moi, je suis un petit peu étonnée de vos résultats.
I am somewhat surprised by your results. Or at least the statements concerning buying from local producers. The figure seems huge. 60% is huge. Well, I am not surprised because other surveys have confirmed this.
Tout type de produit.
So is this for all types of products? Yes. Well, but be careful. It doesn't mean that it is a regular practice or habit. It's just expressed in terms of incidence. This does not mean that people do it every week or every day, but the percentage of people is true. I also have other sources that confirm this figure. So I'm not so much surprised actually, because of the, I would say, the tendency of the French to think local, so, and act local as well. So this is, I think this is very much in line with the rest of the survey. Let's take one last question, maybe?
Ce sera la dernière question d'ailleurs.
Oui, bonjour, merci pour votre exposé.
Good morning, and thank you for this exposé. I am with the Chamber of Commerce of Beaujolais.
Vous envisagez
Do you
l'analyse des nouveaux modèles
contemplate
qui vont découler finalement
analyzing the new economy models that will be derived from these trends?
Tout à l'heure, a priori,
as you briefly mentioned, if we have a change in the behavior, we are likely to have a change in the food behavior, likely to have a change in the economic behavior. You showed this advert for a supermarket chain advertising for Camembert. You mentioned pleasure and interest, but I would also have thought of another dimension, which is about trust. And this is not something that appears in your presentation. What about trusting, for example, major distribution chains with local produce or products? Have you assessed the consumers' behavior for this situation? What do you mean exactly? Well, should the consumer's trust be rather directed to the local producer that you can visit in his workshop or farm, or rather continue buying from a chain store which offers a certain degree of guarantee as to the products or produce they sell? There's some supermarkets chains, as you know, advertise on the fact that the product has been produced following the rules of the art, etc. Well, the survey wasn't based on, wasn't focused on economic models. It was rather on consumers' needs and trends. The consumer doesn't think in terms of economic models. The consumer has needs and longings for. So if the chain stores allow him to buy local, okay, he will certainly use these. Now, if he rather uses these collaborative platforms that exist in France and in other countries, he will certainly turn to these solutions if it is handy for the consumer, if it is practical for the consumer. This is what the consumer wants, in fact. The consumer certainly wants the major players, the major actors in this arena to offer something that he or she wants. I can also speak of hard discount shops. If you remember well, there was a strong push of hard discount in France some 10 to 15 years ago, and at that time people were scared. The people were scared that they would grab the rest of the market. And then came the economic crisis. People thought that would be an opened up avenue for these discounters. And actually what happens is that what happened then was that the sales figure kept dropping. So they had these discounters had to introduce brands in their system. So two things happened, in fact.
aux hard discounters qui faisaient l'essentiel.
The other players, the chain stores, etc., tried to decrease prices, so they did about the same as the discounters.
Et puis le deuxième,
So people then decided to continue going to a supermarket rather than buying from a discounter. And in period of crisis, where everything seems to be gloomy, people fancy rather an attractive product than a more dull product from a hard discounter. So the economic model is also very much based on how the dominating players will react. And in our case, the dominating players are the major chain stores. But the basic issue is, what do the consumers want?
Je voulais dire deux mots quand même.
Okay, let me use my privilege as a chairman to conclude. I would like first of all to congratulate you for this highly interesting presentation. I'm sorry, because this room should have been full. There should have been 650 people sitting here. So my take-home message, with the agri-food business, is that they should have been attending. And I've taken the lessons home from this presentation. But to finish, I'd like to draw a parallel between your survey and the current reforms that are underway in France. You spoke about connected food, but the French don't seem to be very much connected. The Germans are far above us in this direction. Although it is my feeling that food is better in France than in Germany, but the Germans have improved a lot. Now, the reform of the French multi-layered administrative system, it's very specific to France.
Quand on voit qu'on a encore des gens, vous avez peut-être déjà journalistes
costly system.
Ils interviewent, enfin dans mon département, là on a 720 communes, on a mis en avant les gars qui ont des communes à 18 habitants, à 12 habitants.
We have so many communes, as we call them, with just a handful of people living in, so it's a very costly system. So I don't know how we can reform France with this multiplicity.
Écoutez, on est sur l'alimentation, et vous avez raison.
Okay,
il n'y a pas que en matière alimentaire.
We are speaking here about food, and France is indeed a resistant country for many reasons, and sometimes we may be right to resist because we are still a country where we still have good food. I'd like to thank Vitagora for the invitation.
Merci beaucoup, Rémy.